Welcome. I'm delighted to present this workshop today, on this seminar today, on living with life-threatening illness. My name is Dr. Kenneth J. Doka. I'm professor at the Graduate School of the College of New Rochelle and senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. As we move to the next slide, I want you to recognize that this really has to be an intercultural dialogue. I speak from a North American perspective, from a perspective of the United States. And what you need to do is you need to see how this applies to the Brazilian context. What I say is relevant to Brazil, and what I say that may not be as relevant to Brazil. As we move to the third slide, the questions I want to consider today are: how can we really understand the process of life-threatening illness? What are the challenges that people with life-threatening illness face? And how can we assist them? And of course, as you dialogue about this in yourself, I would want to know what your concerns and your questions might be. But that's something that you'll have to determine, and perhaps we can follow up with some kind of feedback or the like. As we move to the next slide, I want to first reference the work of Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. That work was very influential in the United States. I'm not sure how influential it was in Brazil, but it's part of our culture here that many people, even people outside of the field, will talk about what she called the 5 stages of dying, which we'll look at in a minute. And they'll often track their own progress or the progress of a family member by how they perceive them going through these perceived stages. Often I get questions like, how long will somebody be in an anger stage? And if you remember, as we move to the next slide, as you remember Kübler-Ross, she talked about what she called 5 stages of dying. First, there was a denial. This can't be happening to me. Then a sense of anger. Why is this happening to me? And then a sense of bargaining. Maybe if I go to church more or do this or that, this won't happen to me. And finally, a kind of depression. And then finally, acceptance of, well, I guess it is happening to me. I'll have to deal with it. And of course, Kübler-Ross said that throughout all these stages, interwoven is a sense of hope. And that sense of hope may change during the course of the illness. To maybe, I hope I can beat this, to I hope I can live to see my daughter come back from college, to maybe I hope that there is a heaven, or however we look at an afterlife. Now, as we move to the next slide, we can see that Kübler-Ross's work had incredible and great value. Historically, it was really the first popular study in the United States about death and dying. It made the bestseller list. Second of all, it had a heuristic value. It started a dialogue in this country about how we handle the dying and how we deal with the dying. And as a colleague of mine said, Charles Core, it reminded us to be sensitive to the needs of the dying and to communicate with the dying. And Core reminded us that these really are the lessons we should be learning from Kübler-Ross, not necessarily the stages. And as we see from the next slide, there are a lot of criticisms of Kübler-Ross's work. First, really her stages is based, or this concept of stages are based on her work, which is mostly impressionistic. We have no data, we have no figures from her study as to how many people went through these stages, to how many people looked at these reactions. And the research that was done later really has not supported the notion that people who are dying, or for that matter grieving, go through these stages. Clearly, she labeled some common kinds of reactions. Clearly, she talked about some of the ways that people cope. But really, there's no